I should record it to the cloud. But some of you may also consider how you could present this to your students. And I'm happy to share, and please remind me in the end, or at some point, I'll reload into the chat the PowerPoint slides. But I'm also happy to share this as, I've shared it as a PDF, but I'm happy to share it also as PowerPoint slides so that you have it as resources too. Some background on me. I mean, for many of you know me as a colleague, but I also, in our educational leadership programs, I teach a lot of our classes that are connected to equity and diversity. So in our doctoral program, I teach a class on leadership studies for social justice. In our principal program, I'll teach leadership development seminar with a really clear equity lens, as well as a class about how to engage with families for aspiring principals. And in all of those classes, and also in professional development work I've done, there's a common fear that many of my students have. So what is that most common fear as they're beginning to talk about equity work? And for many of my students, I might be one of their first professors of color, first Latina professor I ever had. And I always make this joke of like, oh no, they're going to talk about race and racism, and I'm a professor of color, and how do I do this? And the fear that comes up for them is not knowing how to start talking about these, I'm worried about saying the wrong thing. I care about these issues, but I'm worried about how I'm going to talk about issues of race or inequality, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, disabilities, right? It's a very common fear. And full disclosure, there are stretch areas and equity issues that I am still learning on, right? So I share that fear, but I've learned some tricks. I've learned some techniques of how to engage in talking about these issues and how to really adapt to really an authentic lean in, knowing that there are times I'm going to make a mistake, right? So partially what I hope you get out of this presentation is there are certain ways that we talk about communities and issues, and particularly folks in more marginalized or minoritized situations. But at the heart of it, for me, equity work is all about honoring the human dignity of each person and creating spaces and systems so that each person can thrive, be their full self, and be successful and live in a community of belonging. So if I start with that place, I know that my intentions will be, I wouldn't say pure, but I will try to operate from a loving space and a space of learning always. Okay. So with that, what are some words that I use? So this is going to be a little bit of like, these are words I use. And so at some point you might be like, I can't believe Katherine's doing this, but it actually, for my students and for me, sometimes it's nice to just know, do I say Black? Do I say African American? What is the right word in this situation? So this is kind of what I'm talking about today in terms of the keyword. This is a table that I've pulled. I will acknowledge that the table is a little bit dated. It's from 2007 from a book called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. But I've used this as a resource before because it helps give some great kind of beginning understandings around key issues, and also frames it so we can try to enter in these conversations, especially with our students, with our colleagues or other community members we're working with. Today, I'm going to focus in on race, class, gender, and disability as some of these social identity categories. Again, there is so much that we could talk about related to each of these categories and areas of study. But these are kind of the four where I think of like key starting places for discussions of equity. So first, race. So what are some terms I use? So this is the level of like, I think can be helpful, especially for my students. Folks are coming from completely different places. And the way I think about it is, let's have some starting place to talk about race. So, and what I've seen also folks do, and I say folks broadly, because there might be someone who doesn't have any background in this or is coming to this as a new learner, or maybe someone that's really steeped in how their community talks about certain identities. But providing some grounding for everyone, especially my classes, is really critical so that everyone feels like we've kind of started at the same place. And so for some of you, I know that it might be like, well, this is very kind of at a basic level, but it can be empowering to have a whole group, especially beginning equity work or learning, to have some terms. So what are terms that I use when I'm talking about different communities, specifically communities of color? So both, I will use Black and African American. I do not identify as Black or African American. I am a third generation Mexican American. And so oftentimes I am listening to how folks are talking about a community And especially if I'm listening to someone who is Black or who's African American, I'm listening to how they're talking. So Black is a broader kind of racialized term. It also has connections to Black Power movement, obviously Black Lives Matter movements, and that is the broader term. African American is not synonymous with Black, right? African American can be applied to people who have ancestral roots to being born, raised in the United States, or who might have those ancestral roots to people who were formerly enslaved Africans brought to the United States through the criminal slave trade. And so sometimes if I'm talking, I'm really listening to how other folks, or if I'm in a community that they're talking, or families are talking about, they're using African American, I will start using that term too. But I do tend to use Black more often. For white, sometimes I've heard and I've used Anglo. That's in very specific kind of Latinx communities, as we're talking in Spanish often, or we're translanguaging or code switching, going back and forth. But I do tend to use the word white. More recently, I've heard folks also use Caucasian. More recently, there's critiques, and I'm not going to present about this right now, but there are critiques of the term Caucasian as having more racist roots. And so I think just being aware of kind of how the term is being used and how we're operating is good. I'll use the term Asian American, but also when I'm talking about a specific community, I really try to be as specific as possible. So if a student is Vietnamese, I'll say the student's Vietnamese, and being well aware that that term Asian or Asian and Asian American is being applied to a huge diversity of people, right? It is a huge region, multiple cultures, multiple languages, multiple histories, multiple people. And especially in the context in education, when we talk about Asian students, say in K-12 or even in higher ed, there is a invisibility applied to certain groups and peoples. And so that's why when I say try to be as specific as possible, that's what I really try to do, because what we see are very different kinds of educational outcomes and experiences depending on what Asian subgroup someone's from. And of course, all of these categories, they're categories applied to people and a diversity of communities and people. I also talk about Pacific Islander or Micronesian Islander people. They're not synonymous. Pacific Islander is a broader term. Micronesian Islander applies to a specific kind of group of folks who are part of the COFA, or the Compact of Free Association in Micronesia. Very diverse cultures, histories, languages, and as much as I can being more specific is helpful. So talking about, in Southwest Washington, where a few of us work, there are a large population of Chukis students and families that come who are part of that group. There are Marshallese. I think there's a sizable Marshallese population in Spokane. And so just thinking about, especially if we're working with folks in education or in certain contexts in education, if our students are saying, oh, those Pacific Islander families, that's when there's a moment for an opportunity for us to say, where are they from, right? Offering that, getting to know them. And so stopping, especially, when we hear these short comments that might happen in our classrooms or in conversations about certain groups, pausing and saying, what do you mean by that? Can you say more? Do you know where they come from, right? So there are lots of comments I've heard from students in the past and educators in the past about certain communities. And I try to just kind of pause and have them say, like, let's get some more details. Let's learn and take a learning stance and learning about people. In terms of Indigenous people, and you'll hear me right away, I actually do tend to use Indigenous more, or Native. I'll use Native American as well, or American Indian. It's very kind of rarely or sometimes. I'm very thoughtful about how I talk about Indigenous peoples. That is something, and there's a whole training. I know Zoe Heigl Strong has, and her office has sponsored trainings that have been like an hour and a half long, just about the language and the terms that we use. And I want to really kind of put that forward as really critical learning and helpful. But the terms I tend to use, I am using Indigenous a lot more, or I'll actually use both. So when you see those highlighted yellow, I tend to say them both, or I will, like, for especially for Black African American communities, I'll say that Black African American communities, so that I'm being inclusive and thoughtful around that. For Indigenous and Native American communities, I'll say it exactly like that when I'm talking about that specific, topic. Again, knowing there's multiple nations, multiple peoples, multiple cultures, and so again, trying to avoid essentializing communities. Now, Latinx. So this is a question I get, especially being Latina or Mexican American. And this is kind of my best explanation. So there, and some of you might have seen things on social media or in other spaces of critiques of Latinx. I use Latinx, and I'm realizing I should have put this on the slides. In other spaces, it's Latine, which is in Spanish, basically Latin with an E at the end to be gender inclusive. Latinx tends to be used more in academic, political, and community circles. And it's used, there's some critiques that have come from other Latinos, and I say Latinos very purposefully, Latinos as in, there's been critiques, I mean, in the broad Latinx community, but some also Latino males, men, who critique this. And part of it is that feeling of like, this is a something US, like kind of Americanized thing being put on Latinx people. But actually Latinx has roots in movements for LGBTQ recognition in Latin America. So it's not just some woke-ish professor like me invented it, right? It actually is a purposeful use, and I do use it. I in familial spaces or in community and conversation, I'll probably more often use Latino, Latina. But if I'm very purposeful in a community context, I will use Latinx as a way to center the experiences and visibility of non-binary and transgender Latinx people. I see there's a comment in the chat. Yes, thanks, Anne Marie. Yeah, Latine is a term just mentioned. That's another one that was using that folks use. Again, and that actually tends to be used in, I would say the first times I've heard it were in Spanish, like people from España contexts. Some I've seen it also in more South American contexts, and Latinx in kind of US Latinx contexts as well as in Mexico. But many of us happen to hear Hispanic, or we see it in the census. And Hispanic is, I rarely use it, but for me, it's more of a political choice because I think, to me, that is something, I know my parents use it. I don't correct them. I'm not saying like, oh no, mom and dad, it's Latinx now, get to know yourself. No, if it's the way people identify, I honor and respect that. But for me, there is something about that kind of pan-ethnic identity that means a lot to me as a Latina, and seeing that connection, more political solidarity. But Hispanic, particularly on the east side of Washington State and in certain communities like in Yakima area, Tri-Cities area, people use Hispanic, and especially in Spanish, Hispanos. And so I honor that. I know that that's how people identify themselves, and I respect that. Also, I think it's important Latinos, as in a lot of these racialized categories and groups, Latinx and Hispanic, it's an ethnic category, so it's complicated. It's not a racial category. So Latinx and Latino folks can come from a variety of racial backgrounds, right? And so again, all of these terms can intersect, and really just being aware of them as categories applied to people in groups and not necessarily the essence of someone's identity. Other helpful terms I use when talking about people of color, or just broadly, in this case, marginalized students, it's more inclusive. It doesn't just refer to students of color. I have in the past used BIPOC. I'm starting to not use it as much. There's some, and that stands for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. It's coming under scrutiny in some activist circles. I think the original intent of that concept was to center the experiences and historical forms of oppression that have faced Black and Indigenous people. But again, it's one of those umbrella terms, and when you have an umbrella term, there can be challenges within that. I also just say students of color or people of color too. knowing that that's an incomplete term. Jessica, can you ask the question I just saw about the controversy?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to know, I guess I wasn't aware that BIPOC was coming under, I mean, there's like the scrutiny from the right, but I was unfamiliar with the scrutiny coming from the left. So I didn't know if you had any more to say about that. I can also look this up on my own. So
yeah, so I won't, and I want to be mindful because we're just in like the first few slides and I can just talk and talk. So I have to be thoughtful to not run out of time. But I guess one of the critiques that I've seen, again, in more activist circles is that, and I think this is the intent of the word was to try to center Black and Indigenous perspectives, right? And it also is a political approach. But I see it, and Amy is right, and Amy, if you want to jump in, please feel free to. From Black scholars, I would say that if we mean Black, say Black. That's where I've kind of seen, and I think there's that piece of erasure. Oh, sorry, that's the chat. That can happen among people of color. So to me, this is a conversation, particularly about how we relate and show solidarity as people of color within group. That's where I've seen it. Amy, I don't know if you want to share your experience or kind of what you've heard.
And I can't remember where I read on this a little bit too, unfortunately, but the controversy I heard, and then my friend who's an African-American scholar sort of reiterated this, is that it has been reappropriated from the original intentions. And the original intentions were to, as you said, to really center on Black and Indigenous, and that it was originally not and other people of color. And who's to say really, but there's an understanding that it was really it was originally coined with the idea Black and Indigenous people of color. So Black and Indigenous was the adjective to focus a subgroup of people of color. And then it became reappropriated with and other people of color. And the folks who first worked with BIPOC said that wasn't the intention. It was to really center Black and Indigenous and not make it an umbrella term. So some of the folks who first used it said now they are not, because they think it's basically become another synonym for people of color. And that wasn't the intent.
So thank you, Amy, for sharing that. Yeah. I mean, and that's the piece too around, again, how we think about categories. It means that it doesn't mean we don't use them, but we use them cautiously and knowing that they can't completely capture the experiences of people, right? Again, these are categories and labels, and just how we think about them is important. And the assumptions that they might carry, positive and negative, that come with them, and their intentions beyond them. Another piece, and this is something I do very much when it's in red, it means it's like, avoid it. This is things I've heard. So sometimes it'd be nice to see what do I use, but at the same time, what to avoid. So these terms that I've often heard are terms like diversity students or students of diversity. Now, when I hear that, so diverse students is okay. Like all of our students, we have a diverse student body, fine, right? If it's meant referring to all students, but if it's used as a proxy for students of color or for people of color in some way, then that to me is what I'm hearing that happening. It's usually probably because of the fear of saying the wrong thing, right? And so, and I've also heard scholars and colleagues say culturally and linguistically diverse students, that's fine usually, but again, are we avoiding saying something? And if we are, say the something we mean, right? If we mean Black students, say Black students. If we mean Indigenous students, say Indigenous students. If we mean students of color or non-white students, then we say students of color, right? So just thoughtful, these are terms that I would avoid. Colored students, so usually like in some of us that are familiar with history of segregation in the United States, we know that term was used particularly for about Black people, African American people. It is a historic term, but more recently, what I have noticed, and I have colleagues, specifically colleagues who work with people whose first language is in English, or they're still learning English, and that process, they might say color students when they mean students of color, right? So they making that kind of switch with good intention, oops a daisy, don't use this term, right? Like, so part of it is if we hear someone saying this, say, wait, hold on, do you mean students of color? What do you mean? And then often going back and showing them some images of the segregated South or certain parts of the United States really shows this is why we don't use this term. But that's when I've actually seen it more recently. Some of you might be saying, like, who's saying that? I've actually seen it and heard it before. And that's a quick redirection and correction. Another term that's often used, and this is one that I'll get pushback on when I say I don't use it and I would avoid it, especially with my students, is the term minorities. So, and I'll just read kind of what's on the slide and then explain. So while particular racial groups are still minorities in number in certain contexts, increasingly cannot really refer to people of color as minorities collectively, right? The people of color are actually the global majority. And in some school districts, in some regions and areas, they are the majority. But another reason, and this is one I can give a personal example, I used to use the word minorities all the time. And as a teenager, I remember going to a diversity conference in Seattle and getting scolded by another person of color saying, no, we are not minorities. We are people that matter. We are people who have value. And say, if you mean people of color, say people of color. If you mean, this, mean this, like say the direct group kind of name community you're talking about. And the reason the person then went on to explain it, besides like, kicking my butt and putting me in my place, was really to emphasize that what minorities also suggest, that term, the diminutive embedded in it, the feeling of less than, right? I know that people of color are a minority in our institution. I know that, I feel it, I've felt it being in meetings. I feel my difference, but I need to remember that just because we're a minority number in certain contexts doesn't mean we're actually a minority number, and to understand the power that does exist among the group. So again, it's one of the slight changes that can we be clearer about what we mean and who we mean. And if it does take a few more words, it takes a few more words. And maybe it's clunky and we say our Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, Asian, Pacific Islander, multiracial students, etc. But does it allow someone to be seen or heard? That's okay, right? And I know it can be clunky, but it's just one of those pieces that can be helpful. And if we're doing a shorthand, who is the shorthand serving? So just kind of put that out there and how I think about it. Again, if there's somebody who, like a family member of mine, if my father-in-law, who is African-American, who grew up in upstate New York, if he says I'm a minority, I will not be correcting him. That's his word. He gets to talk about himself. He gets to use that word. So again, as I think about this, as I share some of these key terms, they're not to police people or their identities, but to allow us to operate and speak in humanizing ways. And so that's how I talk about it with my students. Yeah. Oh yes, thanks Amy and Sarah. So minoritized, yes. So I will sometimes say minoritized. Whoops, you see my little sheet go back and forth. And I do use that. Again, I think about it in the context I'm operating in. Do I have time? I'll say quick-hand. I said at the beginning of actually this presentation, it does emphasize structural and systemic inequities, being someone that is minoritized. But I also think of the context of use. So if I'm working a community context with K-12 students or with educators, and it's like, I don't have time to go into that, I will often say marginalize instead, right? Because there's certain words that we're using as academic that we have a quick hand for, we've heard it, we could pause and talk about it. But when I'm working with like Latinx families or families of color who are minoritized, I'm going to be thoughtful about like those of us that are marginalized. Like I might not go into the nuances. If I have a chance to explain and provide some of that information and that critique, I will. But my worry with minoritized in those spaces is that it can be quickly heard as minorities because that's what people are more familiar with. So that's how I think about minoritized. It's like, do I get to say that in my academic spaces, but does it resonate with people in their lived experiences? I don't know if that's helpful. Okay, so class. Class is a little bit more straightforward, hopefully. Basically, my general rule, I'll go to the yellow part, then I'll explain the terms I use. I'm much more careful, and this actually goes for most any of the categories. With the categories and labels I apply to individuals who are in more marginalized situations. That to me is like one of the golden rule of all of this. How am I talking about people who are experiencing oppression or have experienced systemic inequities? How am I, and I do this with especially when I think about my students who are, educators full-time, or they're leading systems, like how are they modelizing, humanizing talk? And so I think about that, especially when I think about class. Do I worry about what multi-millionaires and billionaires, like how I talk about them? No, because they're going to be fine however I talk about them. I don't really matter to them very much, right? But will I use caution in how I talk about low-income families and people from low-income backgrounds? Yeah, right. And even then I made an error. Like I tried to flip it. I tried to use that more kind of first and first language. So people from low-income backgrounds, families or students living in poverty. Again, if someone grew up poor and they say, I grew up poor, I come from a poor family, I respect that. They claim that that's a part of who they are and they're proud of their roots. I won't correct someone, right? I won't correct someone who's experienced those kinds of financial hardships. I know, and I felt that as a child. But I will be especially careful about how I talk about people and how I model that to my students, because of the embedded deficit perspectives and assumptions made about people, especially who come from low-income backgrounds who have experienced extreme financial hardships or financial hardships broadly. I'll say middle-class families or middle-class backgrounds, and I'll say wealthy families or rich people. That I'm not so worried about. I do tend to be very careful about how I talk about low-income or people living in poverty. And I certainly absolutely avoid and correct when my students talk about things like a culture of poverty, which is very harmful deficit frame of how we talk about people from low-income backgrounds. I'm happy to share, if someone's interested, I'm happy to share work about critiquing that notion of the culture of poverty, but it is still something that was created many, many years ago by an anthropologist who was studying Mexican and Puerto Rican families living in very, very poor circumstances. Actually, he's not Mexican anthropologist. He was a US anthropologist, but studying Mexico and Puerto Rico, sorry. But anyways, it was created back then and really swiftly critiqued by many educational scholars, linguists, and anthropologists, but it was picked up in political circles and used to talk about Black families experiencing poverty in the United States, and then used in very harmful ways. But it is still, unfortunately, alive and well, especially in education circles, and something that we see for folks to try to understand and talk about low-income families, but it can be quite harmful. So anyways, I'm happy to share more resources about that. Okay, oh, and my slide is now having a little issues. Okay, so now about gender and then sexual orientation, some keywords. So first, an important consideration of what I'm about to present, and all of this applies to kind of all the categories, but the LGBTQ plus umbrella involves a diverse array of identities related to sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, right? So, and just like with a lot of the categories, the broad LGBTQ plus community is very diverse and not a monolith, right? So like putting that up front, like please know this. This is not the end all. You didn't take the 3 slides I prepared and now you're an expert, right? Like I just want to make sure. And these are things, by the way, I tell my students, I know you all are thinking that. I also want to highly recommend and say today, well, first not recommend, but just say today is very surface level grounding. I highly recommend engaging in deeper learning related to LGBTQ plus inclusion through the WSU Vancouver BASE program and WSU's Community and Equity Certificate program. One of our amazing graduates, Matthew Jeffries, Dr. Matthew Jeffries, has created and worked with other facilitators and trainers to develop a really wonderful LGBTQ plus ally training that's offered online and available to all the campuses. I know that the base program is only available to WSU Vancouver. I will hint that both the Equity Inclusion Committee and also LGBTQIA plus Advisory Council are working on potential learning series for next year. Stay tuned for that. But I just want to say what I'm about to present is very surface level, very kind of basic grounding. Okay? But please continue to learn about all of these topics and areas. So what do I use? What terms do I use? This is an area that's a stretch area for me. And again, I want to try to model how I talk about this. I identify as a cisgender, straight, heterosexual woman. I occupy a lot of privilege when I'm talking about these issues. So I think very thoughtfully, and this is an area that I've had to learn about over the years, and I'm continually learning. So the more common terms that I use, there's many more to learn about when talking about gender identity, sexual orientation, the broad kind of LGBTQ plus community and issues. I tend to use the term transgender, cisgender. I'll talk about men, women, trans men, trans women, or who are also men and women. And I will often use also the term non-binary. LGBTQ plus stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning. You might have just heard me say LGBTQIA, the I for intersex, A for asexual, or sometimes uses ally, and it depends on what we mean. I try to be thoughtful about using that term ally, just because I think the ally is a verb in this case and needs to be actively earned and isn't assumed. I don't just get to call myself an ally. But within educational spaces, because there's so many complex layers here, we're usually talking about gender and not sex or gender assigned at birth. We're talking about gender. And the more we can differentiate between sexual orientation and gender, the better. And that's often where we see in especially K-12 context, a lot of the controversies. There are adults, full-blown adults, who are not differentiating this and having some understanding around it. That's a whole other conversation we can have. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Jennifer. Yeah. So gender queer is another way to kind of think about identifying. So how breaking down some words, and this is where I'm going to actually give a little bit of definition and put it on the slide to make sure we have this. So transgender is a general term used to describe a person whose gender identity is different from that traditionally associated with the person's sex or gender assigned at birth. And really clear piece here on language, because I hear this a lot. Transgender, not transgendered, the ED. Sometimes people do that. No, wrong. Like that is like, no, I'm all nuanced here and there. Nope, this is wrong. Transgender. Just be mindful about that ED getting added to it. Sometimes I hear that when folks are getting flustered or kind of talking fast. Cisgender is a term for someone whose gender identity matches the gender assigned at birth. I have been using more often gender assigned at birth and not sex, but that's another conversation and a whole other piece we could talk about later. But I do try to use gender because that's what really is the thing that we're talking about and relating around. Gender expansive. So this, and Jennifer Gallagher gave us a hint in the chat. Thank you, Jennifer, for kind of putting in that. Yeah, so this is where it's like being thoughtful and careful with language and being clear on what I mean, right? So I put the word non-binary on the slide, but gender expansiveness is much broader, right? So a term for people who challenge cultural expectations regarding gender roles and identities, expressions, or norms. And this quote comes from a really wonderful article I will post in the chat. So give me 1 second to do that, by Melinda Mangan. And it's all about supporting gender and gender expansive children in schools. There we go. So check out that article, super helpful learning. Some important work that Melinda does. There's many different scholars who do important work around LGBTQ plus inclusion in schools and in education. I'm happy to share more resources about this. So multiple terms here: non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, two-spirit, which has roots in among Indigenous peoples, and also gender non-conforming. Again, hearing how people describe themselves and honoring that, right? That's a whole journey, and just recognizing that. all of this is about kind of pushing against that, the binary that we've been socialized in. Again, just touching the surface here, so much more to talk about here, but I wanted to provide some language because often what I've heard, and I will just say directly, and this is an area that I think we want to continue to invest in as a college and learning, so that we can recognize the diversity of human experience fully, right? But being clear on like, this is a stretch area for me and an area I continue to learn in and wanting to model that. But recognizing and just the reason these topics are coming up is that folks who are gender expansive have been here forever, right? It's just finally, so I remember hearing a student once said, oh, this newfangled thing, right? It's not a trend. We're opening, the world has become more tolerant, or at least hopefully, although I know that there's pushback, lots of legislative things happening, terrible things happening that are targeting LGBTQ plus folks, but knowing that that expression, that openness we have the vocabulary now to talk about this, and listening to folks who are gender queer, who are gender nonconforming, or trans, and non-binary, to honor their experiences and how they talk about themselves, right? So just wanted to kind of provide that. Again, stay tuned for some more potential programming from the College of Ed, but also know that there are opportunities to learn and expand on our campuses, particularly through the Equity and Community Certificate, as well as the base program in Vancouver. Another emphasis here, I just want to make sure, yes, like I said before, sexual orientation is not gender identity. So I know that sounds like, oh, I get that, Katherine, duh. But this is something I emphasize again and again. Literally, I have a lecture where I do for my students, and I put this on 5 slides and I repeat it again and again for them to get it, because a lot of the controversy and concerns around locker rooms and sports and bathrooms have to do with conflating these two completely different identities. And the more we can continue to be advocates around this and share this, the more we can try to emphasize that they are different. So when we have a transgender first grader, that we believe them and we know that that's their identity, right? And we are not stigmatizing them in some way because of our own connections as adults, making connections that aren't there. So I just want to emphasize that as I transition. So finally, ability. Again, this is an area that is not my specialty. I am a scholar that focuses a lot on issues of race and some gender, but really race. And so I want to honor that. But how I talk about this still, and modeling that, even though I'm not an expert around disability at all, there's ways that I can talk about it intelligently and thoughtfully, and just with authenticity and humility. So part of what I do know enough, I know enough to be dangerous, right? But I know enough that the category of disability is inherently posited as a lack of ability, right? We've had terms in the past like handicap, right? Not a term I use, but I'm just putting that in quotes. When it's in quotes, it means it's a term I'm not really using. It's a term that exists in the world. Or thinking about that, even the term disable or dis and then abled, right? This kind of lack of within the definition. But to disrupt this, I tend to talk about disability as something someone has or has been given rather than something that defines them. So again, person first. I'll get to the part where there's more complexity here as we talk about more movements of recognition, the disability rights movement. Okay, I'll get to that part because this doesn't always apply, but that's how I talk about it. I also have a focus on disability as social construction, as something that's created, that we've created in our society. And so what do I mean by this? So, and I'm going to read a quote. So yes, it's going to be a lot of text on the slide. But this is from Charlton in his book about the disability rights movement. It's his story. It's a historical book called Nothing About Us Without Us, a Disability, Oppression, and Empowerment. So I really appreciate his definition. Again, this book is a little bit old, I think from 2000, but it's still very helpful in how we think about a critique of how we think about disabilities. So he writes, for my purposes, disability is based on social and functional criteria. This means first, that disability is not a medical category, but a social one. Disability is socially constructed. For example, if a particular culture treats a person as having a disability, the person has one. Second, the category disability includes people with socially defined functional limitations. For instance, and this in his writing, deaf is not capitalized. Typically, deaf is capitalized. Okay. Deaf people are considered disabled, although many deaf individuals insist they do not have a disability. People do not get to choose whether they have disabilities. Most political activists would define disability as a condition imposed on individuals by society. I remember reading that in college, so years ago, and being just like my mind blown, right, to understand. And so to me, the bigger learning here too was there's a whole critique, and we have colleagues, I think we have a few colleagues here in Zoom, in the Zoom space, who are experts in special education, but that there's a whole critique from disability studies, disability critical studies, critical disability studies, and critical race theory combined. I mean, so this whole area, there's a whole area of study to understand and critique and make sense of this notion of disability. And to me, the most important piece is how folks with disabilities define themselves and honoring and understanding that. So I've had students who are blind or have low vision. I've had deaf students, and the way my deaf students have talked about their deaf culture as being so important to them. I think that is something that has been a learning for me, but one that I really lean into and honor in the work I've done with them. So other piece kind of under the piece by Charlton. So I do say individuals with disabilities, or when I tend to work with my students for administrators, especially ones who are running special services or special education programs, I'll say students categorized as having a learning disability or students who qualify for special education services. A quick and fast thing I hear all the time, SPED kids, my SPED kids, or our SPED population. And that is something that I try to get folks to say, listen, again, I know you're busy, I know it's fast and it's quick, but what are we doing to children when we call them that? Because they know, right? Especially in those K-12 contexts. And I go to think about the work of a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Anne-Marie Baines, who wrote this wonderful book. Again, it's a little old now, but it's wonderful. It's called Unlearning Disability, Recognizing and Changing Restrictive Views of Student Ability. And so what Anne-Marie did, she's an anthropologist. She did work with a group of students who, teenagers at the time, who were all diagnosed as being at different places on the autism spectrum. And she actually got to know them not in school context. She was their debate coach and she worked with them and debate team. And then decided, well, what if I go and see what school's like for them? And what she realized was like these amazing, incredibly creative and wonderful people she got to work with every day were treated absolutely different in school. And so she wrote, students have to contend with choreography, things happening in schools and in educational environments that produces moments for degradation or praise. And so a quote, just one of the many quotes from one of the students. He's like, I hated being calling. So the student had ADD also. And so the person said, I hate being calling ADD. They label you and it's over. People look at you and you are that, they label you. And so basically the student was fully aware of the way the adults talked about them and treated them. And so knew that they had challenges, but also knew that it limited how people saw them, and that they were trying, often these young people were trying to like outrun their disability, outrun the label post on them. And so anyways, just another book that might be of real interest to you. It's really beautifully written. And Anne-Marie at the time was a professor, but then left the academia and started her own nonprofit called the Practice Space, and works with students with disabilities in public speaking and debate. So if you're interested, check out Anne-Marie's work. Also, Emma, I just saw your comment. Yeah, no, thank you, Emma. That's really great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. So I think that's another level of like talking about how we think about being currently able-bodied, right? So that at different points in our life that might change. And being aware of that, I think, is really critical. So thank you for sharing that, Emma. Let me check on time. Okay, about 10 minutes left. Let me wrap this up. So The other piece too, again, as I mentioned a little earlier, cultural groups talking about deaf culture, that they, many deaf folks do not see themselves as having a disability as a part of their culture, something they're proud of. Also, different disability rights organizations have ways of talking about disability. There's a movement, it's been going on for some time, to reclaim the term disabled, right? And to say I'm a disabled person. And so honoring that again, and that knowing among all of this, terms change over time, how we talk about things changes over time. All of these terms have been different at one point in history. And so just having awareness about that is really important. So overall points to consider, and then I'll kind of wrap up and open for questions. My first point that I would say, my recommendation, try to understand the history of a term and who the term is referring to. As I mentioned, Black is not synonymous with African American, Hispanic's not synonymous with Latino, Latinx, white is not the same as Anglo. The context of use matters. So understanding that, knowing that the term also might change. And that's a part of how we grow and change as people and a society. Point two, asking how do the members of the group refer to themselves? How do they want you to refer to them? Because they may not be the same, right? What is their word? And what is the word I should not be using, and being thoughtful around that. Also thinking about terms like say for example, like LGBTQ refers to, versus LGBT queer, that's a reappropriation, kind of a taking back from a term that had been a slur. But if it's used as a slur, it is a slur, right? Like, it's real, right? So being thoughtful around when that term is used and how we use it, and also knowing that there's certain terms like the term gay is not a bad word, but sometimes people use it as a bad word, right? So thinking around how it's being used and how are we working to be allies in different spaces. I will say this unequivocally, N-word. The N-word is never appropriate for someone who is not Black or African American to use. I've had students, this is one of the times I've made a student cry in class. She would read Huck Finn in her class, and that word is there. And she's like, for literary purposes. And I said, no, it is not appropriate. You do not have to read that word. You could skip over the word. You could say the N-word and you can talk about it, but we can't then turn around and ask people. And in her case, she had asked her students, her Black students, is this okay if we read this? She'd asked as a teacher, 2 teenagers, is this okay? Not going to get the right answer, right? So having her think through, like, it is not okay. And if you've read it in the past, you've said it in the past, there was harm caused, and rethinking that, but it's not okay. Again, for someone who's not Black or African American, right? It is not my job. And my beloved father-in-law will say that word to his friends in a different version of it. And it's not my job to police him, right? I am not Black. I have to understand that. So again, language matters, and there are no hard or fast rules, but need to understand context, place, and strategy. And then wrap up, and I'll wrap up in 2 more minutes. We'll have 5 minutes, which isn't a long time, but I'm happy to stay after for other additional questions. What if I make a mistake, right? You've heard me kind of even trying to model this. I've made mistakes already. Take a deep breath, own up to it, and take responsibility, right? Intent versus impact. I didn't mean to do it, but I did it. I hurt somebody. So what does it mean to try to seek repair and heal? Apologize and explain your learning. You can blame me. Say, I went to this thing with Katherine and I just learned this and I realized this. I apologize. It's okay. We learn. It's okay to have made mistakes, but go back and try to heal and know that we might not get resolution, but we have made that intent to fix this. And importantly, do not expect marginalized people of color, LGBTQ+ persons to carry the load or educate. Seek, but do not expect forgiveness, right? So knowing that it is not my job to call my gay best friend and say, please teach me. No, he does not owe me that, right? I need to do the work. If I want to learn and be a better ally to my colleagues, my friends, I need to do the work for myself and unlearn my privileges and make sense of that. And that takes you all taking time today, 100%, but also doing that extra work, looking at videos, looking at resources. Now, what if I hear someone say something inappropriate? Now, I know we've been in those meetings and so-and-so said something, or a student said something where it's like, What do I do? Again, take a deep breath first and foremost. Read the situation. So, can I intervene now? Does it make sense to intervene now? Do I need a timeout? I've had to do this in my classes. I've had to do this in meetings before. I've had to say, oh, I need a timeout. What you said really is I'm having a hard time with emotionally. And of course, that's when I did that in class one time, everybody got real serious. And I was like, I need a timeout because I need a space because what you said is affecting me and I need to take a moment. And I'm sorry, but we need to take a break. Very serious, right? I did it, but I did it because I knew I would not be able to respond in a way where I'm calm. But sometimes I have to respond in the moment because the hurt on someone else is going to be pretty severe, right? So I have to take that moment and say, I need to read the situation. Can you circle back? Is it a coaching moment, a check-in later? Hey, can we have a time to chat? Something, I was just thinking about something that happened in the meeting and I want to talk to you. Obviously, it raises the bar in seriousness, but it allows us time to plan. And sometimes when I'm going to have a hard conversation, I just write what I need to say on a piece of paper for myself to practice. I do that, especially when it comes to these topics. I know they can be very hard. Will this require repairing a relationship? I've had a moment in class where someone said something about a student of mine compared a gay families, gay marriage to polygamy. And I just was like caught off guard, and I'll just admit this is what happened. And it really, I was like, well, and I didn't address it the way I should have in the moment in the class. And I hurt one of my students who is lesbian and she's married and wonderful. And we talked about it and I had to repair that relationship. And I went through, because I didn't correct like the way I should have at that level, because part of it too was like the other person was trying to explore their thinking and ideas. But what I didn't realize in the moment, as I was focusing on this person's learning and trying to push them, in the moment, it seemed like I'd agreed with what the person was saying and the comments and connections they were making. And I didn't stick up for families, lesbian families, gay families, like I should have, gay parents and lesbian parents. And so I caused harm and I needed to go back and fix that relationship and then make sure that other student knew full blown what they did was wrong. So that took an extra hour, but it was worth it. And I own it. And I'm really embarrassed. When I think about it, I still feel embarrassed. Like in the middle of the night, I'll wake up and be like, oh, remember what you did to so-and-so? I still hold that, but that is my burden to bear. And I am just grateful that that other student came and talked to me about it, right? But again, that is stuff I did. I am an associate dean of equity and inclusion, and I still screw up. So I want you to know that's very real. And the way we continue to do that is through authentically working on those relationships and owning it up. Again, what if you hear something inappropriate? Blame Katherine again, making clear it's not okay, right? I just learned, I took a class or whatever. I just had this thing I had to do, brown bag, and I just learned we're not supposed to say that. You can go use this for at least a few weeks, right? Or I read, and then modeling for others and showing up as allies, our students, our colleagues, right? In that moment where I screwed up, this was 5 years ago, and it sticks with me. I'll never do that again, right? I will think not just about this one person's learning, it's also the way it makes the rest of them feel. If I realize that this one person's uncomfortable, if I'm not willing, so for example, with race, if I'm not willing to talk to them because they're uncomfortable talking about this, how is it making my students of color feel if they're saying, why are we talking about this, right? I got to think about the broader impacts, even though my intent is on this one student's learning. So those are those balances we make in the class, and it can be really tough. But more importantly, there's no shaming or blaming. Knowing how to say things the right way or politically correct is much less important than seeking to address inequities in our schools, districts, colleges, universities, or communities. Authenticity matters. So being your most authentic self and being willing to learn, but also not just saying, well, I just tried, I did my best, right? Here is it's a call to action and calling in that we can do this together. So I'm going to stop here, just highlight in April, you'll see more emails from me that Shameem's going to do a great talk on the problem of colorblindness. I know we're already at time, but I'll stick around for questions or comments. Thank you all for being such wonderful listeners. And I'll just open up the floor, but if you need to head out, I understand. Thank you so much for joining. But I'll open up for questions and I'll stick around as long as folks want to chat. Thank you, everybody.